Blizzard hearts, the crack of her father's palm against the wooden table, echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, making Tabitha Monroe flinch as snowflakes drifted through the cabin's poorly sealed windows. It was January 1878 in the unforgiving Montana Territory, and the blizzard outside matched the storm brewing within. "You disobeyed me for the last time, girl." Jacob Monroe's voice thundered as he rose from his chair, knocking it backward onto the rough-hewn floor. His massive frame, hardened by years of failed mining ventures and heavy drinking, cast a shadow that seemed to swallow Tabitha whole. "I told you to stay away from that trading post. You think I don't hear the gossip? You think I don't know what they say about you batting your eyes at every man who passes through?" "I wasn't," Tabitha began, but her words died in her throat as her father's meaty fist raised, his face contorted with a rage she knew too well. "Pa, please," she whispered, backing away until her spine pressed against the cold wall. At 20 years old, Tabitha had endured her father's unpredictable temper since her mother died of fever 5 winters ago. But something was different tonight. The whiskey had darkened his eyes to something unrecognizable, something that chilled her more than the howling wind outside. "You're just like your mother," he snarled, advancing toward her. "Always thinking you're too good for this life, always dreaming of something better." When his fist smashed into the wall beside her head, splinters of wood showering her cheek, Tabitha knew she couldn't stay. Not tonight, maybe not ever again. As her father turned to pour another drink, she slipped toward the door, grabbed her mother's tattered shawl, and fled into the raging snowstorm without even pausing for boots. The bitter cold bit into her feet immediately, sending shockwaves of pain up her legs. But the fear driving her forward was stronger than the cold. The snow had already accumulated to mid-calf depth, but Tabitha pushed on, her thin cotton dress providing little protection against the elements. Her breath came in visible puffs as she stumbled through the darkness, guided only by the faint knowledge that the main trail lay somewhere to the east. Time lost meaning as she pushed forward. Minutes or hours could have passed as the cold numbed her feet and fingers. The darkness swallowed everything except the endless white of the snow. When Tabitha finally stumbled and fell, her body trembling uncontrollably, she wondered if this was how it would end, frozen in a nameless stretch of Montana wilderness, with no one to mourn her passing. As consciousness began to slip away, the crunch of approaching hoofbeats penetrated the howling wind. A lantern's glow cut through the darkness, and a deep voice called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" Tabitha tried to answer, but her voice emerged as a weak croak. She raised a trembling hand just as a horse and rider materialized from the swirling snow. The man dismounted quickly, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached. His tall frame blocked the worst of the wind as he crouched beside her, the lantern illuminating a face framed by a dark beard and concerned eyes. "Good Lord, miss. What are you doing out here in this storm?" He quickly removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shivering form. "And with no boots, had to run," Tabitha managed through chattering teeth. The stranger's expression hardened as he noticed the bruise forming on her cheek where she'd caught the edge of her father's swing earlier that evening. Without another word, he scooped her up as if she weighed nothing, his strong arms secure around her trembling form. "You're safe now," he said, his voice a low, steady promise as he lifted her onto his horse. "I'm Flynn Thorne. I've got a cabin not far from here. We need to get you warm before frostbite sets in." As he mounted behind her, his solid presence blocking the wind, Tabitha felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of safety. She leaned back against his chest as he guided the horse through the blizzard, too exhausted and cold to worry about propriety, or the fact that she was placing her trust in a complete stranger. "Thank you," she whispered, her words nearly lost in the howling wind. Flynn's arm tightened around her waist. "Just stay awake, miss. We'll be there soon." The journey to Flynn's cabin passed in a blur of swirling snow and increasing numbness. When a small, sturdy cabin finally appeared through the storm, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire inside, Tabitha nearly wept with relief. Flynn dismounted quickly, then lifted her from the saddle. "My foreman's inside. He's a good man, don't be frightened." He carried her to the door, which swung open before he could knock. An older man with weathered features stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Hank, heat some water and grab those extra blankets," Flynn ordered as he carried Tabitha inside. "She's been out in the storm with no boots. We need to warm her feet slowly." The cabin was modest but well built, with a roaring fire in the stone hearth and the comforting scent of coffee and wood smoke. Flynn gently set Tabitha in a chair near the fire, then knelt to examine her feet, his expression grim. "These need attention right away," he said, his gentle hands contrasting with his rough appearance. "What's your name, miss?" "Tabitha," she managed through trembling lips. "Tabitha Monroe." Recognition flashed in Flynn's eyes. "Jacob Monroe's daughter, from the old claim at Bitter Creek," she nodded, fear returning at the mention of her father. "Please, I can't go back there, not tonight." Flynn's jaw tightened. "No one's sending you anywhere in this storm, Miss Monroe. And not back to him at all, if what I suspect happened is true." Hank returned with a basin of lukewarm water and clean cloths. Flynn carefully immersed Tabitha's feet, explaining that they needed to warm them gradually. As feeling painfully returned to her extremities, Tabitha studied her rescuer. Flynn Thorne was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. His hands, now carefully tending to her frozen feet, were calloused from hard work, but his touch remained gentle. He wore the practical clothing of a working rancher rather than the flashy attire of the gamblers and drifters who sometimes pass through town. "You own a ranch?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the painful tingling in her feet. Flynn nodded. "Northstar Ranch." "It's modest, but it's growing. I came west after the war, started with just 20 acres and a dream." A small smile softened his serious expression. "Now I have 500 acres, a decent herd, and enough work to keep me busy until Judgment Day." "The boss is being modest," Hank interjected as he handed Tabitha a cup of hot coffee. "Northstar's becoming one of the most respected operations in the territory. Flynn here has a way with horses that folks talk about from here to Cheyenne." Flynn's cheeks colored slightly at the praise. "Hank exaggerates. You feeling any better, Miss Monroe?" The warmth from the fire and coffee was slowly returning sensation to Tabitha's body, though her feet still throbbed painfully. "Yes, thank you, both of you." "You should rest," Flynn said, rising to his feet. "You can take my bed." "I'll bunk with Hank in the other room." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Flynn interrupted firmly. "You've been through enough tonight without arguing over sleeping arrangements." Too exhausted to protest further, Tabitha allowed Flynn to help her to a small but tidy bedroom. He provided her with a clean shirt to use as a nightgown and promised to check on her feet again in the morning. "No one will hurt you here, Miss Monroe," he said from the doorway. "You have my word on that." When he closed the door, leaving her alone, Tabitha sank onto the edge of the bed. For the first time since fleeing her father's cabin, she allowed herself to cry not just for tonight's terror, but for the years of fear and loneliness that had preceded it. As she slipped between the clean sheets that smelled faintly of pine and soap, she wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether she had finally found a safe harbor in this unforgiving territory. The morning brought pale sunlight filtering through frost-covered windows. Tabitha woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the memories of the previous night came rushing back. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her feet. A soft knock at the door preceded Flynn's voice. "Miss Monroe, are you awake?" "Yes," she called, hastily pulling the blankets up to her chin, though she remained fully clothed in Flynn's oversized shirt. Flynn entered carrying a tray with a steaming bowl, biscuits, and coffee. "Thought you might be hungry, and I need to check those feet again." He set the tray beside her, then pulled a chair close to the bed. His hair was damp, as if he'd already been outside in the snow, and his clean-shaven jaw revealed features that were even more handsome than she'd realized in the previous night's chaos. "How long did I sleep?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. "Almost 14 hours. Your body needed the rest." He gestured to her feet. "May I?" Tabitha nodded, extending her feet from beneath the covers. Flynn's expression remained professional as he examined them, though his touch was tender. "You're fortunate," he said after a thorough inspection. "No serious frostbite. They'll be painful for a while, but with proper care, you'll heal completely." Relief washed over her. "Thank you for everything." Flynn's eyes met hers, their brown depths serious. "Miss Monroe, I don't mean to pry, but I need to ask. Was it your father who drove you out into that storm?" Tabitha looked away, shame heating her cheeks despite the fact that she'd done nothing wrong. He was drinking. He gets angry when he drinks. Has he hurt you before?" The quiet question hung in the air between them. Tabitha had never admitted the truth to anyone, had become skilled at hiding bruises and making excuses. "Yes," she finally whispered, "but never as bad as he might have last night. I saw something different in his eyes. Something that frightened me enough to run." Flynn's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "You did the right thing, Miss Monroe. No one has the right to harm you, not even your father." "I have nowhere else to go," Tabitha admitted, the realization settling heavily on her chest. "No relatives, no friends close enough to impose upon. You can stay here until you're healed and decide what you want to do," Flynn said without hesitation. "I have a housekeeper who comes by 3 times a week. Mrs. Hollister is a respectable widow who can serve as chaperone when she's here. The rest of the time, Hank and I will ensure your reputation remains intact." Tabitha stared at him, surprised by the offer. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Something flickered in Flynn's eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly masked. "Because someone once did the same for me when I needed it most. Eat your breakfast before it gets cold. We can talk more later." Over the next several days, Tabitha slowly recovered her strength. True to his word, Flynn was a perfect gentleman, providing her with clothing borrowed from Mrs. Hollister's daughter and giving her space to heal both physically and emotionally. As January gave way to February, Tabitha began to feel useful again. Though her feet remained tender, she insisted on helping with cooking and mending. She discovered that Flynn, for all his capability with ranch work, was hopeless at darning socks and patching shirts. She took over these tasks gladly, finding satisfaction in the simple domestic work. On a clear, cold afternoon about 2 weeks after her arrival, Tabitha sat by the window mending one of Flynn's shirts when the sound of approaching horses drew her attention. Her heart stuttered when she recognized her father's stocky figure among the 3 riders approaching the cabin. Flynn entered from the back room just as Tabitha backed away from the window. "He's here," she whispered, terror constricting her throat. "My father." Flynn's expression hardened as he moved to the window to confirm. Without a word, he retrieved his pistol from its holster hanging by the door and checked that it was loaded. "Stay inside," he instructed calmly. "You don't have to speak to him if you don't want to. Flynn, he's dangerous when he's angry." "So am I," Flynn replied, his voice deceptively soft. "Trust me, Tabitha." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow that simple intimacy gave her courage. She nodded, watching as Flynn stepped outside to meet the approaching riders. Through the window, she could see her father dismount, his movements suggesting he was sober today but no less intimidating. The two men with him remained on horseback. She recognized them as miners who sometimes drank with her father at the saloon in town. "Thorne," her father called, his voice carrying clearly through the closed door. "I've come for my daughter." Flynn stood on the porch, his stance relaxed but alert. "Good afternoon, Monroe. What brings you out this way? Don't play games with me, rancher. I know you've got Tabitha. The storekeeper saw you bringing her into town for supplies last week. Miss Monroe is recovering from nearly freezing to death after fleeing into a blizzard without boots," Flynn replied, his voice level but carrying an edge that made Tabitha shiver. "She's welcome to stay here as long as she wishes." Jacob Monroe's face darkened. "She's my daughter, and she's coming home with me today." "She's a grown woman who can make her own decisions," Flynn countered. "And from what I've seen, she has good reason to fear returning to your cabin." "You questioning how I raise my own kin?" Monroe took a threatening step forward. Flynn didn't move. "I'm questioning why a father would drive his daughter into a deadly storm with his fists." The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Monroe's companions exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly not having heard this version of events. "That's a damned lie," Monroe growled, though his eyes shifted away. "She's always been dramatic, just like her mother. Probably told you all sorts of tales. She didn't have to tell me anything." The bruises spoke clearly enough. Flynn's hand rested casually near his holstered gun. "Now, I'll ask you politely to leave my property. If Miss Monroe wishes to speak with you, that's her choice. But she won't be forced to go anywhere." Monroe's hand twitched toward his own pistol, but one of his companions leaned down from his horse and murmured something that made him hesitate. After a tense moment, Monroe spat on the ground. "This isn't over, Thorne. A man has rights to his family." "And a woman has rights to her safety," Flynn replied steadily. "Good day, gentlemen." Monroe glared at the cabin, his eyes finding Tabitha in the window. The hatred in his gaze made her shrink back, but she forced herself to stand her ground. After what seemed an eternity, he turned and mounted his horse. The three men rode away, Monroe's rigid back radiating fury. When Flynn returned inside, Tabitha was trembling but dry-eyed. "He'll be back. Probably with the sheriff next time, claiming I stole something or making up some other excuse." Flynn poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her. "Sheriff Dawson is a fair man. He won't force you to return to an abusive home. Besides, you're of legal age. My father has friends in town. People respect him because he puts on a different face in public." Tabitha wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "Thank you for standing up to him. Few people do." Flynn's expression softened as he studied her. "You stood up to him too, Tabitha. It takes incredible courage to leave everything you know, even when staying means danger." She hadn't thought of it that way before. In her mind, fleeing had been an act of cowardice rather than courage. Flynn's perspective shifted something inside her, allowing her to see her own strength for perhaps the first time. "What will you do now?" Flynn asked after they'd sipped their coffee in comfortable silence. Tabitha considered the question carefully. "I need to find work. I can sew well enough and I know how to keep accounts. My mother taught me before she died. Mrs. Hollister mentioned that her sister in Helena is looking for help in her dressmaking shop," Flynn offered. "If you're interested, I could write to her." The thought of moving to Helena, a real city compared to the small mining communities she'd known all her life, was both terrifying and exhilarating. "That's very kind, but Helena is nearly 100 miles away. I couldn't afford the stage fare." "Consider it an investment in your future," Flynn said. "You can repay me when you're established." Tabitha studied him, trying to understand his motives. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. Yet Flynn had been nothing but respectful since the moment he found her in the snow. "Why are you doing all this for me?" she asked directly. Flynn set down his cup, his expression thoughtful. "When I came west after the war, I was broken in ways that weren't visible. A family took me in, gave me work, treated me like a human being when I'd forgotten what that felt like." His eyes met hers. "Sometimes people need a helping hand, not because they are weak, but because everyone deserves a chance to build something better." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Tabitha. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps her life could be more than just enduring from one day to the next. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what he was offering, not just practical help, but dignity and choice. Flynn smiled, transforming his serious features into something that made her heart skip. "You're welcome, Miss Monroe." As February progressed, Tabitha's strength returned fully. Her feet healed without complication, though the memory of that desperate flight through the snow would remain with her always. She began to assist more around the ranch, finding satisfaction in productive work and Flynn's quiet appreciation. Mrs. Hollister's sister in Helena had responded positively to Flynn's inquiry, offering Tabitha a position with room and board included. The stage would leave in early March, giving her time to prepare for this new chapter in her life. Though Tabitha knew the opportunity in Helena was more than she could have hoped for, the prospect of leaving Northstar Ranch and Flynn filled her with an unexpected melancholy. In the short weeks she'd been there, the ranch had become more of a home than her father's cabin had ever been. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Hank having retired early with a cold, Flynn noticed her pensive mood. "Having second thoughts about Helena?" he asked gently. Tabitha looked up from her mending. "No, it's a wonderful opportunity. I'm grateful for it. But—" Flynn prompted, setting aside the ranch ledger he'd been reviewing. "But I'll miss this place," she admitted. "It's strange how quickly somewhere can begin to feel like home." Flynn's expression softened. "This will always be a place you can return to, Tabitha. You've made quite an impression on all of us, even that ornery cook who claims no one makes biscuits as light as yours." She smiled at the mention of Hank's gruff compliments. "I've learned so much here, not just practical things, but how people can treat each other with kindness and respect." She hesitated, then added quietly, "I've learned what it feels like to be valued." Flynn's eyes held hers across the room, something unspoken passing between them. "You are valued, Tabitha, more than you know." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. Over the weeks, she'd become increasingly aware of Flynn as more than just her rescuer, aware of the way his smile transformed his face, how his hands moved with surprising grace for such a powerful man, how his voice deepened when they spoke alone in the evenings. Before either could speak again, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. Flynn rose quickly, his expression shifting to alertness as he moved to the window. "3 riders," he reported, reaching for his gun belt. "It's too dark to see who." Tabitha's heart raced, her mind immediately conjuring images of her father returning to force her home. "Could it be my father again?" "Stay here," Flynn instructed, buckling on his gun belt. "If there's trouble, go out the back and hide in the barn until it's safe." The knock that came was authoritative but not threatening. Flynn opened the door to reveal Sheriff Dawson standing on the porch, flanked by 2 deputies. "Evening, Flynn," the sheriff said, nodding respectfully. "Miss Monroe, sorry to disturb you so late." "Come in, Sheriff," Flynn invited, relaxing slightly though his hand remained near his pistol. "What brings you out here?" The three lawmen stepped inside, removing their hats. Sheriff Dawson was a tall, lean man with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who'd seen the worst of human nature, but hadn't lost his fundamental decency. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," the sheriff said, his eyes moving to Tabitha. "Miss Monroe, there was an incident in town today involving your father." Tabitha's hands clenched in her lap. "What kind of incident?" "He and some associates attempted to rob the bank in Silverdale. Things went badly." The sheriff's voice gentled. "I'm sorry to tell you that your father was killed in the exchange of gunfire." The news hit Tabitha like a physical blow. Despite everything her father had done, despite the fear and pain he'd caused, he was still the last family she had in the world. A complex swirl of emotions, grief, relief, guilt, left her momentarily speechless. Flynn moved to her side, his solid presence anchoring her. "I'm sorry, Tabitha," he said quietly. She nodded, struggling to find her voice. Was anyone else hurt?" "The bank manager was wounded but will recover," Sheriff Dawson replied. "Two of your father's associates were captured. They're claiming your father was the ringleader." "That sounds like him," Tabitha said softly. "He always had schemes that never quite worked out." The sheriff cleared his throat. "There's another matter, Miss Monroe. Your father's cabin and claim. As his only kin, they pass to you now. It's not much, but it's legally yours. I've had my deputies secure the property until you can decide what you want to do with it." Tabitha hadn't considered this possibility. The cabin held few happy memories, but it was something that belonged to her, perhaps the first thing she'd ever truly owned. "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll need to think about it. Of course, no rush on decisions." He replaced his hat. "The undertaker is preparing your father's body. The funeral can be held whenever you're ready." After the lawman departed, Tabitha sat in stunned silence, trying to process the abrupt severing of her last family connection. Flynn moved quietly around the cabin, making coffee and giving her space with the intuitive understanding that had become characteristic of their relationship. When he finally placed a cup in her hands, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel," she confessed. "Is it wrong that part of me feels?" Relieved, Flynn sat beside her, his shoulder barely touching hers in a gesture of support. "There's no right way to feel, Tabitha. Your father hurt you, threatened you. It's natural to feel relief that the threat is gone. It doesn't make you a bad person. But he was still my father. There were times when I was young, before my mother died and the drinking got worse, when he was different, when he taught me to fish and told stories by the fire." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I've been mourning the loss of that father for years already." Flynn's hand covered hers, warm and reassuring. "Then perhaps what you're feeling now is the final acknowledgement of that loss. You can honor the good memories while still recognizing the harm he caused." His wisdom and the gentleness with which he offered it broke something open inside Tabitha. She turned into his embrace, finally allowing herself to cry not just for her father's death, but for all the years of fear and loneliness, for the father he could have been but wasn't, for the childhood that had ended too soon. Flynn held her securely, one hand stroking her hair as she sobbed against his chest. He made no attempt to quiet her grief, simply providing the safe harbor she needed to weather the storm of emotions. When her tears finally subsided, Tabitha remained in the circle of Flynn's arms, drawing comfort from his steady heartbeat beneath her ear. She knew she should move away, that their position was far too intimate for propriety, but she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. "I don't want to be alone tonight," she whispered. Immediately blushing at how forward the words sounded, Flynn's arms tightened briefly around her. "You're not alone, Tabitha. I'll sleep in the chair right here if you want. You don't have to face this by yourself." The simple offer, made without expectations or conditions, confirmed what Tabitha had already begun to suspect, that her feelings for Flynn Thorne had grown into something far deeper than gratitude or friendship. In his quiet strength and unwavering respect, she'd found something she hadn't dared hope for. "Thank you," she said, finally pulling back enough to meet his eyes. "For everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't found me that night." Flynn's gaze was tender as he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I think you would have found your way, Tabitha Monroe. You're stronger than you know." The funeral for Jacob Monroe was a small, somber affair held in the cemetery outside of town. Despite her father's difficult reputation, several miners and townspeople attended out of respect for Tabitha. Flynn stood beside her throughout the service, a silent pillar of support. Afterward, as they rode back to the ranch in Flynn's wagon, Tabitha felt a strange sense of closure. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibilities that hadn't existed before. "I've been thinking," she said as the ranch came into view, "about my father's cabin." Flynn glanced at her, his expression open. "What have you decided?" "I want to sell it. The land, too. It's not worth much, but combined with what little money he had in the bank, it should be enough to give me a start in Helena." She hesitated. Unless you think that's foolish." "It's not foolish at all," Flynn assured her. "Sometimes a fresh start needs to be exactly that, fresh, without ties to bind you to the past." Tabitha nodded, relieved by his understanding. "The stage to Helena leaves in 5 days. I should be ready by then." If she'd been watching more closely, she might have noticed the flicker of something like regret in Flynn's eyes before he nodded. "We'll make sure you have everything you need for the journey." The days leading up to Tabitha's departure passed too quickly. She packed her few belongings, along with some practical gifts from Mrs. Hollister, and a beautiful shawl that Flynn had purchased for her in town, for those cool Helena evenings. He'd said with a shy smile that had warmed her heart. On her final evening at Northstar Ranch, Hank prepared a special dinner, then tactfully retired early, leaving Tabitha and Flynn alone by the fire. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the flames and the distant howl of a coyote. "I'll miss our evenings like this," Tabitha finally said. Looking up from the embroidery, she was finishing a handkerchief with Flynn's initials that she'd been working on secretly as a parting gift. Flynn's eyes met hers across the room. "I'll miss them too. The ranch will seem emptier without you here." Something in his voice made Tabitha's heart beat faster. She set aside her needlework, gathering her courage. "Flynn, I want you to know how much these weeks have meant to me. Not just because you saved my life, but because you showed me what kind of life is possible." Flynn rose from his chair and moved to sit beside her on the small sofa. "Tabitha, before you go, there's something I need to say." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "These past weeks have changed me. Seeing your courage, your kindness, your determination to build a better life. It's reminded me of things I'd forgotten." "What things?" she asked softly. "That life is meant to be more than just work and duty. That sharing your days with someone who understands you is a precious gift." His eyes, normally so steady, revealed a vulnerability that took her breath away. "I didn't plan this. I didn't expect to feel this way, but I can't let you leave without telling you that I've come to care for you deeply." Tabitha's heart soared at his words, even as uncertainty clouded her joy. "I care for you too, Flynn. More than I thought possible after knowing someone for such a short time. But Helena is still the right choice for you," Flynn finished firmly. I would never ask you to give up this opportunity. You deserve the chance to build your own life, to discover who you are without someone else defining your path." The selflessness of his words only deepened Tabitha's feelings for him. "Then why tell me this now?" Flynn's smile was tinged with sadness. "Because some things need to be said, even if the timing isn't perfect. And because I want you to know that whatever you decide about your future, there will always be a place for you here if you want it." Tabitha reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "What if I decided I wanted that place to be beside you? Not now, but someday, when I've proven to myself that I can stand on my own." Hope brightened Flynn's eyes. "Then I would be the happiest man in Montana Territory. But Tabitha, you have nothing to prove to me. I already know your strength." "It's not about proving anything to you," she explained. "It's about proving it to myself. I need to know that I choose you because I want to, not because I need rescuing." Understanding dawned in Flynn's expression. "How long do you think you might need?" "Give me 6 months in Helena," Tabitha said, surprising herself with the certainty she felt. 6 months to establish myself, to learn the dressmaking trade, to know that I can support myself if I need to. Then, if you still feel the same way." "I will," Flynn promised, his voice deep with conviction. 6 months, 6 years, it wouldn't matter. What I feel for you isn't going to change." The tenderness in his eyes drew Tabitha forward until their faces were inches apart. "May I write to you?" she whispered. "I'll be counting the days between letters," Flynn answered, his gaze dropping to her lips. Tabitha closed the remaining distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened as Flynn's arms encircled her. His mouth was warm and gentle against hers, the kiss conveying all the feelings that words couldn't fully express. When they finally parted, both breathless, Flynn rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the day you mended my favorite shirt," he confessed with a smile. Tabitha laughed softly. "I've been wanting you to do that since the day you stood up to my father on the porch." They remained close, talking softly by the fire until the embers burned low, sharing hopes and dreams, learning the small details about each other that friends might not discover. When Tabitha finally retired to her room, her lips still tingling from Flynn's goodnight kiss, she felt not sadness at their impending separation, but hope for the future they might build together. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the stage scheduled to depart at noon. Flynn loaded Tabitha's small trunk onto his wagon for the journey into town, his manner outwardly calm though his eyes revealed the emotions he was containing. Hank surprised Tabitha with a small parcel of biscuits for her journey. "So you don't forget what real cooking tastes like in that city," he grumbled, though his eyes were suspiciously bright as he awkwardly patted her shoulder. Mrs. Hollister, who had arrived early to say goodbye, pressed a letter of introduction to her sister into Tabitha's hand, along with a motherly hug. "You'll do wonderfully, dear. Helena will be lucky to have you." As they drove toward town, Flynn and Tabitha spoke of practical matters, the route the stage would take, the name of the boarding house where she would stay until Mrs. Hollister's sister could arrange accommodations, when mail could be expected to reach Helena. The conversation was deceptively normal, as if they were discussing a brief trip rather than a separation of at least 6 months. But beneath the practical words ran a current of deeper feelings, expressed in glances, and the way Flynn's hand occasionally covered hers on the seat between them. The town was busy when they arrived, the stage already being loaded with mail and packages. Flynn secured Tabitha's trunk to the back while she purchased her ticket. When there was nothing left to do but wait for the final boarding call, they stood slightly apart from the bustle of the street. "I have something for you," Flynn said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small drawstring pouch. "I was going to wait, but, well, I'd rather you had it now." Tabitha opened the pouch, gasping softly when a delicate silver locket slid into her palm. The oval pendant was engraved with a small star, a miniature version of the Northstar Ranch brand. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her finger over the engraving. "Open it," Flynn urged gently. Inside, she found a tiny scrap of paper with a single sentence written in Flynn's strong hand. "You're safe now, and always will be." Tears welled in Tabitha's eyes as she looked up at him. "Will you help me put it on?" Flynn took the locket, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck as he fastened the clasp. When she turned to face him again, he smiled at how right it looked resting against her collarbones. "A reminder," he said softly, "that no matter where you go, you carry my promise with you." Last call for the eastbound stage to Helena. The driver shouted, breaking the intimate moment. Flynn picked up Tabitha's small carpet bag. "Time to begin your adventure, Miss Monroe." As they walked to the stage, Tabitha was acutely aware of how different this departure was from her desperate flight into the blizzard 2 months earlier. Then, she had run from danger with nothing but fear driving her forward. Now, she was walking confidently toward a future of her own choosing, with the knowledge that someone who truly cared for her would be waiting when she was ready to return. At the stagecoach door, Flynn helped her up the step, then held her hand a moment longer than necessary. 6 months, he said quietly. 6 months, she confirmed, squeezing his fingers before releasing them. As the stage pulled away from the station, Tabitha watched through the window as Flynn's figure grew smaller. He remained standing in the street long after the other well-wishers had dispersed. His tall form the last thing she saw before the stage rounded a bend in the road. Tabitha settled back against the leather seat, her hand rising to touch the locket at her throat. Though uncertainty lay ahead, for perhaps the first time in her life, she faced the future not with fear but with anticipation and hope. Helena proved to be everything Tabitha had hoped for and more. The bustling territorial capital was a far cry from the small mining communities she'd known, with its brick buildings, wooden sidewalks, and surprising touches of civilization. A library, a proper hotel, even a theater that occasionally hosted traveling companies. Mrs. Hollister's sister, Margaret Wilson, welcomed Tabitha warmly into both her home and her dressmaking business. A widow in her 50s with capable hands and a practical outlook, Margaret quickly recognized Tabitha's natural talent with a needle and her eye for design. "Most girls I train take months to develop the touch you already have," Margaret commented during Tabitha's second week, inspecting a bodice Tabitha had constructed. "Your stitches are nearly invisible." Tabitha blushed at the praise. "My mother taught me when I was young. It was one of the few things that pleased my father, that I could mend his clothes without him having to pay someone." Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "Well, my dear, those skills will serve you well here. This is artistry, not just utility, and clients pay handsomely for artistry." True to her word, within a month, Margaret was allowing Tabitha to work directly with some of their regular customers, measuring, fitting, and consulting on designs. The work was satisfying in a way Tabitha hadn't anticipated, combining creativity with precision, and the joy of seeing a client's face light up when they saw themselves in a perfectly fitted new garment. Each evening, Tabitha wrote to Flynn, filling pages with descriptions of her day, the interesting people she met, the gradual confidence she was developing. His letters in return became treasures she kept in a special box beneath her bed, reading and rereading them until she could hear his voice in the written words. Flynn wrote of the ranch, the spring calving, the new foal born to his favorite mare, the progress on the expanded barn. He described the changing seasons in the valley, sometimes including pressed wildflowers that reminded him of her. Though his words were often practical, the underlying current of longing matched her own, growing stronger as the months passed. As spring turned to summer, Tabitha found herself flourishing in Helena. She made friends among the other young women who worked in shops along the main street, occasionally joining them for social gatherings or Sunday picnics. Several young men expressed interest in courting her, but Tabitha gently declined, her heart already spoken for though she wore no official token of engagement. In her 4th month in Helena, an opportunity arose that tested Tabitha's resolve. Mr. Phillips, owner of the largest dry goods store in town, approached Margaret about expanding her dressmaking business into his establishment, creating a dedicated ladies' department with Tabitha as the head seamstress. It would mean more money, more prestigious clients, Margaret explained as they discussed the offer over tea. Mr. Phillips is prepared to offer you a 3-year contract with very favorable terms. Tabitha's fingers unconsciously rose to touch the locket she wore every day. 3 years. Margaret studied her with knowing eyes. This has something to do with those letters you receive so regularly from Northstar Ranch, doesn't it? Blushing, Tabitha nodded. Flynn and we have an understanding. I promised to give myself 6 months here to establish independence before making any decisions about our future. And those 6 months are nearly up, Margaret observed. Have you found what you were looking for, Tabitha? The question gave her pause. Had she? She'd proven she could support herself, had developed confidence in her skills, had experienced life in a bustling town far different from her father's isolated cabin. Yet something was missing, the sense of home she'd briefly found at Northstar. I've found part of it, she answered honestly. I've discovered that I'm stronger than I knew, that I can build a life on my terms. But I've also learned that independence doesn't have to mean being alone. Margaret's smile was warm with approval. That's wisdom many people twice your age haven't grasped. So what will you tell Mr. Phillips? That I'm honored by his offer, but my future lies elsewhere. As Tabitha spoke the words, certainty settled in her heart. It's time for me to go home. The next morning, Tabitha wrote 2 letters, one to Mr. Phillips politely declining his generous offer, and one to Flynn that contained just 3 words. I'm coming home. His reply arrived with record speed, delivered by special messenger rather than the regular mail coach. Tabitha's hands trembled as she opened it, finding a single line that made her laugh with joy. I'll be waiting at the stage stop. Bring your sewing kit. Hank has managed to put holes in every sock he owns. In the 2 weeks before her departure, Tabitha worked diligently to complete all her outstanding projects at the shop. Margaret, far from being disappointed by her decision, helped her prepare for the journey with practical gifts and advice. You've become like a daughter to me these past months, Margaret said as they packed Tabitha's trunks, now considerably fuller than when she'd arrived. Promise you'll write regularly, and perhaps you and your rancher can visit Helena occasionally. We will, Tabitha promised, embracing the older woman. And you must come to the ranch someday. It's beautiful in its own way, wilder than Helena, but with a grandeur that takes your breath away. On her final evening in Helena, Tabitha sat alone in her room, reflecting on the transformation of her life in just 6 short months. From a frightened young woman fleeing barefoot into a blizzard, she had become someone who faced the future with confidence and purpose. The journey hadn't been without challenges, but each obstacle overcome had strengthened her belief in herself. As she tucked Flynn's letters carefully into her trunk, Tabitha's fingers lingered on the first one she'd received, where he described watching the sunset from the ridge above the ranch and thinking of her. "This land has a way of becoming part of you," he'd written. Or perhaps it's that you become part of the land. Either way, it feels incomplete without you here to share it. Now, after experiencing life in a thriving town with all its amenities and opportunities, Tabitha understood what Flynn had meant. She had come to Helena to prove her independence, but what she discovered was what truly mattered to her, and that was returning to Northstar Ranch not as someone seeking refuge, but as a woman making a deliberate choice. The westbound stage departed Helena on a perfect summer morning, the journey expected to take 2 days with an overnight stop at a way station. Tabitha spent the hours watching the landscape change, growing wilder and more rugged as they left the comparative civilization of the territorial capital behind. When familiar landmarks began to appear on the second day, Tabitha's excitement grew until she could barely sit still, earning amused glances from her fellow passengers. As the stage finally rolled into the small town near Northstar Ranch, her eyes searched eagerly for Flynn among the small crowd waiting at the station. She spotted him immediately taller than most of the others, his broad shoulders and straight posture unmistakable even at a distance. He wore his good shirt and had trimmed his beard, but otherwise looked exactly as she remembered, his eyes scanning the stage windows until they found her. The moment the driver set the brake, Flynn was at the door, reaching up to help her down. Tabitha barely had time to set foot on the ground before his arms were around her, lifting her in a joyful embrace that ignored the curious onlookers. "Welcome home," Flynn murmured against her hair before setting her gently on her feet, though he kept one arm firmly around her waist as if afraid she might disappear. "Home," Tabitha repeated, the word filling her with contentment. "It sounds perfect." After retrieving her trunks and loading them into Flynn's wagon, they set off for the ranch. The familiar landscape rolled by the distant mountains, the winding creek, the stands of pine that broke up the open grassland. Everything looked more vibrant than Tabitha remembered, gilded by the knowledge that she was seeing it now not as a temporary refuge, but as the place she had chosen to be. "The ranch has missed you," Flynn said as they crested a rise that revealed Northstar spread below them, the buildings nestled in a protected valley. "Hank's cooking has gotten worse, if that's possible. The chickens stopped laying properly. Even my favorite mare has been moody." Tabitha laughed, leaning against his shoulder. "And what about the rancher? Has he missed me too?" Flynn's arm tightened around her. "Every single day. The house felt empty without you. I found myself listening for your footsteps, looking up expecting to see you by the fire with your sewing." The simple honesty in his voice warmed Tabitha more than any flowery declaration could have. "I missed you too. Helena was wonderful in many ways, but it never felt like home the way Northstar does." Flynn guided the horses down the slope toward the ranch, his expression turning more serious. "Tabitha, before we arrive, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes, these past 6 months. Did they give you what you needed? Are you certain this is what you want?" Tabitha turned to face him fully, touched by his concern that her decision be truly her own. "More certain than I've ever been about anything. I needed that time to know my own mind, to be sure I was choosing this life, choosing you because it's what I truly want, not because I had nowhere else to go." Relief and joy transformed Flynn's features. He pulled the wagon to a stop, turning to take both her hands in his. "Then there's something else I need to ask, something I've been waiting 6 months to say." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box, opening it to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring set with a small diamond that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Tabitha Monroe, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need protection or security, but because together we could build something beautiful." Tears of happiness blurred Tabitha's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Flynn. Yes, with all my heart." Flynn's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into a kiss that held all the longing of their months apart. When they finally continued toward the ranch, they did so as an engaged couple, planning their future together. Hank was waiting on the porch when they arrived, attempting to maintain his gruff exterior, but failing miserably as he welcomed Tabitha with an awkward hug. "About time you came back," he muttered. "Maybe now Flynn will stop moping around like a lost calf." Mrs. Hollister arrived shortly after, having been alerted to Tabitha's return, and there was much celebration when the engagement was announced. Plans were quickly made for a wedding in September, when the heaviest ranch work would be completed, and the weather would still be fair enough for an outdoor celebration. That evening, after the others had departed, Flynn and Tabitha sat together on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge above the valley. His arm rested comfortably around her shoulders, her head nestled against him as if they had been this way for years rather than hours. "I want to show you something," Flynn said, reaching into his shirt pocket. He withdrew a folded piece of paper, carefully preserved. "I've carried this with me every day since you left." Tabitha unfolded it to find a sketch of a house larger and more refined than Flynn's current cabin, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides, multiple bedrooms, and a dedicated sewing room with large windows for natural light. "I started building it 2 months ago," Flynn admitted, a touch of shyness in his voice. "It's about half finished up on the ridge where the view stretches all the way to the mountains. I hoped it might be where we would start our life together." Touched beyond words, Tabitha traced the careful lines of the drawing. "It's perfect, Flynn. Absolutely perfect. I wanted to create something worthy of the woman you've become," he said softly. "Strong, independent, but also kind and full of grace." Tabitha turned in his arms to face him. "Do you know what I thought about most often in Helena? Not the fancy shops or the theater or the social gatherings. I thought about that night you found me in the blizzard, how you said you're safe now, and how, for the first time in years, I believed it might be true." Flynn's eyes were tender in the fading light. "You'll always be safe with me, Tabitha. Not because I'll protect you though I would with my life, but because together we create something stronger than either of us could be alone." As the stars brightened above Northstar Ranch, Tabitha and Flynn sealed their promise with a kiss, the future stretching before them as vast and full of possibility as the Montana sky. The wedding of Flynn Thorne and Tabitha Monroe took place on a perfect September afternoon, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold against the evergreen backdrop. The ceremony was held on the ridge near their new home, which Flynn had completed with the help of neighboring ranchers just days before. Tabitha wore a gown of ivory silk that she had designed and sewn herself during the summer months, with Margaret Wilson traveling from Helena to assist with the final details. Mrs. Hollister had woven wildflowers into Tabitha's hair, and she carried a bouquet of late-blooming roses from the small garden she had started behind Flynn's cabin. The wedding party was small but meaningful. Hank stood as Flynn's best man, while Margaret served as Tabitha's matron of honor. Sheriff Dawson officiated, his usually stern face softened by the evident joy of the couple before him. Neighbors from surrounding ranches and friends from town filled the rows of chairs set up on the grassy hillside, the community coming together to celebrate a love story that had begun in the depths of winter, but blossomed into something enduring and true. When Flynn and Tabitha exchanged their vows, promising to cherish and support each other through whatever challenges life might bring. There wasn't a dry eye among the guests. The sincerity in their voices and the light in their eyes spoke of a bond forged through adversity and strengthened by the choice to build a life together based on mutual respect, understanding, and deep affection. After the ceremony, tables were set up beneath a canopy of white canvas, laden with food prepared by the women of the community. Fiddle music filled the air as the celebration continued into the evening, lanterns casting a golden glow over the gathering as the sun set behind the mountains. Flynn and Tabitha moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but always returning to each other's side, their hands naturally finding each other as if drawn by an invisible force. The happiness radiating from them touched everyone present, a reminder that even in the sometimes harsh reality of frontier life, love could flourish and bring joy. As darkness fell and the stars emerged, the newlyweds slipped away from the celebration to stand on the porch of their new home, looking out over the land that had brought them together. "Mrs. Thorne," Flynn said softly, drawing Tabitha into his arms. "How does it sound?" "Like the beginning of the most wonderful story," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. "Our story." Flynn's kiss was tender, a promise of all the days and nights to come. "It began the moment you fled barefoot into that snowstorm," he murmured against her lips, "though I didn't know it then." "No," Tabitha corrected gently, her eyes shining with love in the starlight. "It began when you found me there and said those words I'll never forget. You're safe now." As they stood together on the threshold of their new home and their new life, the past with all its pain receded like shadows before the dawn. What remained was the certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, their love a sanctuary as vast and enduring as the Montana sky stretching above them and the land spreading out before them, wild, beautiful, and theirs. Epilogue. 5 years later, the morning sun streamed through the east-facing windows of the Thorne family kitchen, illuminating Tabitha as she stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal while keeping a watchful eye on 3-year-old Sarah, who was carefully setting spoons on the table under her mother's guidance. "That's right, sweetheart. One for everyone," Tabitha encouraged as the little girl, her dark hair falling in curls around a face that mirrored her father's strong features softened into delicate femininity, concentrated on her important task. From outside came the sound of laughter, followed by the thud of running footsteps on the porch. The door burst open to admit 5-year-old James, his cheeks flushed with excitement and his clothes already showing evidence of morning adventures. "Mama, Papa says the new foal can be mine to raise," he announced, his eyes exact replicas of Tabitha's wide with importance. "I get to name her and everything." "That's a big responsibility," Tabitha replied, trying to hide her smile at her son's enthusiasm. "What will you name her?" Before James could answer, Flynn appeared in the doorway, holding their youngest 10-month-old Thomas, who was reaching out eagerly for his mother. "This little cowhand is hungry," Flynn said, his voice warm with affection as he handed the baby to Tabitha. "And his papa could use some coffee after chasing him around the barn while trying to check on the new foal." Tabitha accepted the baby with one arm, using her free hand to pour Flynn's coffee. The practiced ease of their movements around each other spoke of 5 years of partnership, the initial passion of their romance having deepened into something even more precious, a comfortable intimacy built on shared joys, challenges overcome together, and unwavering mutual respect. As the family gathered around the breakfast table, with James chattering about his plans for the foal, Sarah carefully eating her oatmeal one precise spoonful at a time, and baby Thomas happily babbling in his mother's lap, Tabitha caught Flynn's eye across the table. The look they exchanged held a world of unspoken, understanding gratitude for the life they'd built, pride in their growing family, and the enduring love that had begun on that snowy night when a desperate young woman had fled barefoot into a blizzard and found not just safety but her future in the arms of a kind-hearted rancher. Northstar Ranch had prospered under their joint stewardship. Flynn's expertise with horses had made their breeding program renowned throughout the territory, while Tabitha's business acumen developed during her time in Helena and honed through practical experience had helped them expand thoughtfully, investing profits wisely and planning for the future. Tabitha still sewed, though now it was primarily for her family and special commissions from friends. The sewing room Flynn had designed for her had become one of her favorite places in their home, a space where she could create beautiful things while watching her children play in the yard beyond the windows. After breakfast, as Flynn prepared to return to his work with the horses and Tabitha settled the children for their morning lessons, she had decided to teach them herself. Until they were old enough for the small school in town, he paused in the doorway, watching his family with quiet contentment. "What are you thinking about, looking so serious?" Tabitha asked, coming to stand beside him after setting the children up with their slates. Flynn's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. "I was thinking about how differently things might have turned out. If I hadn't ridden out to check the north fence line that night, if I hadn't heard you in the snow." Tabitha leaned into his embrace, understanding the depth of his reflection. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be." Flynn pressed a kiss to her temple, his beard softer against her skin than it had been in those early days. "You've made me the happiest man in Montana territory, Tabitha Thorne. Every day, I thank whatever fate or providence led me to you that night." "And I thank you," she replied softly, "for keeping the promise you made when you found me that I would be safe. You've given me more than safety, Flynn. You've given me a home, a family, a life filled with purpose and joy." As they stood together in the doorway of the home they had built, watching their children, and surrounded by the life they had created through love, hard work, and unwavering commitment to each other, Tabitha's hand rose to touch the silver locket she still wore every day, the tangible reminder of a promise made and kept through all the seasons of their lives together. Outside, the Montana landscape stretched to the horizon, as wild and beautiful as it had been on that winter night when their story began. But Tabitha no longer saw it as a harsh, unforgiving wilderness. In Flynn's arms and with their children's laughter filling their home, she recognized it for what it truly was, the perfect setting for their love story. A tale of courage and second chances that had begun with a desperate flight through the snow and culminated in the warmth of a family bound together by love that grew stronger with each passing day.